Trails and Ghost Towns. Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barley.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts and Bill Barley. I always find myself rubbing my hands together, you know, as the show begins, because the word gold has a fascination for me, and we're going to one of the world's great gold finds today.
Yeah, we're going to only touch on 1 year, Mike. Essentially one year. Because we're talking about the Klondike, we're talking about the Yukon Gold Rush, and of course, you know, that lasted for actually decades, and there were 5 top years. So we're going to concentrate from 1894 and then settle on 1896.
Now, for us to just settle on 1 year is a rare commodity, but give us the locations. Dawson is, I guess, the city we all think of in the Yukon.
Sure, but what we have to do prior to that, there were several other cities along the Yukon River. There was Eagle City on the American side, there was 40 Mile, and there was a little place called Ogilvie. And really, we start our story at a little trading post called Ogilvie in 1894.
Now, what's special about Ogilvie? Who was Ogilvie?
Well, Ogilvie was named after William Ogilvie, who was a Dominion land surveyor, and he was sent into the Yukon by the Canadian government in the early 1890s to survey all the creeks, survey the entire area, because I think there was some feeling in Ottawa that we might lose this area to the Americans who had bought Alaska from the Russians in 1867. So we decided to survey the boundary line, survey the mountains, survey the creeks, survey everything, and Ogilvie was an admirable pick. This guy was, not only was he efficient, not only was he industrious, he was dead honest as well.
So was it his work which said there could be gold in that country? Did he turn up anything like that, or was he strictly a line drawer?
Well, prior to 1894, there was gold in that country. You know, I mean, but there weren't any great amounts of gold. There were patches and places where the miners worked, but they didn't make a king's ransom. Now we're looking at a place where they do make a king's ransom.
All right, take a break. When we come back, the area on the Yukon River, remember the names Ogilvie, 40 Mile, Dawson. We're going to all cover that area, plus take a look at riches beyond belief in just a second. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts and Bill Barley with the Yukon. 1894, Ogilvie's doing his survey thing.
Right.
And how does this in any way stimulate what's going to happen in the next 24 months?
Well, what happens is this. They name a little trading post after Ogilvie, a guy called Joseph Ladeau. And Ladeau has been in the Yukon. He wants to get enough money so he can go back and marry his childhood sweetheart. He hasn't made it yet, but he's the original promoter. And every time a prospector puts in at that little trading post called Ogilvie, which is situated on the banks of the Yukon River, above 40 Mile, he makes sure they stay. And so down the river come 3 prospectors. One of them is a guy, Canadian, Nova Scotian, called Robert Henderson. Been all over the West. Tramp prospector, Mike. He's gone all over in every gold rush. Robert Henderson has been there. He has never made it. So they put in, they see this little trading post. They put in their canoe at the trading post, and all 3 of them get out. They're greeted by Ladeau, and Ladeau says, "You've arrived at the right spot. This is gold country." 2 of them don't believe him at all. But Henderson, he has a feeling that maybe he's right, and Henderson isn't about to quit. He's a very dogged, single-minded sort of individual. So he says, "Sure, you stake me, I'll go and look for the mother lode." So this is 1894. The other 2 vanish in the
We don't even know who they were.
Don't even know who they were.
So Henderson, though, sticks with the help of Nadeau and his grub stake.
Sure. Ladeau gives him a grub stake. Each year he goes out, and he tramps all through that country, on the Indian River, north, south, east, and west. He doesn't hit it. But finally in 1896, on the other side, kind of the northeastern side of a dome, which eventually became known as King Solomon's Dome, this barren hill up there, he hits a little creek, and he had a dream that he was going to make it there. And so he called the creek Gold Bottom. And he gets 10 cents a pound, which is pretty good colors. And at that time, with gold, about $14, $15 an ounce. And he decides to stake it. That's his discovery claim. And he does stake it, and he does some work on it, and he gets a little better ground. And eventually he gets to about 35 cents a pan. Now, this is good ground. It's fairly coarse gold, but it isn't spectacular gold. And then fate intervenes. What happens is there are 3 Indians now drifting down the river. A guy called George Washington Carmax, who is better known as Lying George.
Lying George.
Yeah. He had a tendency to exaggerate, to embellish the truth. With them are 2 very interesting Indians. So Lying George is a white man. He's married to an Indian woman. And, but his brother-in-law is with him. His brother-in-law is called Skukum Jim.
Skukum Jim.
And Skukum Jim was one of the finest looking Indians ever to come out of the Yukon district. Strong as a horse, intelligent, had everything going for him, and was kind of a semi-prospector. He liked to prospect. And then the other individual was a guy called Tagish Charlie, who was later known as Dawson Charlie. And he's also a relative of Carmack's. All 3 of them are related through marriage. And so they run into Henderson. And of course, they've run into Henderson before, and so Carmack says, "Well, what do you got, Bob?" And Bob says, "Well," he says, "I got a pretty good find, but Bob has a character flaw. He doesn't like Indians." And so he tells Carmack about this find, which he's made up in a creek he calls Gold Bottom, and he said, "I think there's gold all through that area." And so he shows Carmack some of the small pieces of gold, and Carmack is vaguely interested, but Skukum Jim is very interested. And then they try to borrow some tobacco, which they're short of. So Carmack and the 2 Indians are short of tobacco, which they won on their trip. Now Henderson goes against the miners' creed. He doesn't lend them any because of the 2 Indians. And this will eventually work against him. So they part company, and a few days later, after they've done some fishing and some cutting wood and so on, they decide to go up and prospect a little creek they called Rabbit Creek. And Rabbit Creek, it flows into the Klondike, which then flows into the Yukon River. And so they begin to prospect in Rabbit Creek, and there's several...
This is Carmack and Skukum Jim and Tagish Charlie.
That's right. Henderson goes back to the other side of King Solomon's Dome, and he's still on Gold Bottom.
Trying for 35 colors a pan or
That's
something
right,
like
35 cents a pan. And so they go up on Rabbit Creek, and it's a marshy creek. It's low-lying, and it doesn't look too good. So probably the true version is this. Carmack lies down and goes to sleep under a tree. But Skukum Jim decides to prospect. And he comes into this, and he starts and getting into some of the bedrock, a little bit of the bedrock in the area, and getting down into the gravels, and he comes up with coarse gold.
Stuff just like this?
Just like that, only some of it larger, some of it's quarter-ounce slugs, which is very close to some of the golds you have in your hand.
So even though Carmack's getting a lot of credit in modern press, it's Skukum Jim who's the nugget finder.
Oh yeah, Skukum Jim is the finder, and I think he is probably the second discoverer of the discovery in the Klondike district. Carmack takes all.
Obviously, Carmack wakes up from his sleep at this time.
Sure, he wakes up, but they can't believe their good luck. They dance a jig around the fire, and then Carmack's, being the white man, he stakes it right there, and that's the discovery claim, which is just above the junction of another little creek coming in there, and that other little creek eventually becomes known as El Dorado, becomes world famous. And Rabbit Creek soon becomes not Rabbit Creek, which is too common. That's a very commonplace name. It becomes Bonanza.
Bonanza Creek.
Sure.
El Dorado, Bonanza. And meanwhile, old Henderson, who wouldn't lend a fellow miner a plug of tobacco, is toiling away north in much poorer ground.
That's right, much poorer ground. And what happens then is, again, a break in that unwritten miner's law. Really, what should have happened, Carmack should have gone over and made sure, he knew where Henderson was. He should have gone over and told Henderson, but instead he goes down towards the mouth of the creek, and everybody he sees, and they know him as Lying George, so the only way he can prove it, he puts all his gold in a shotgun shell. That's the only container he has. He didn't expect to find gold up there. And when he comes and tells them the story, they say, "Sure, Lying George," and then he pours it out on the counter, or wherever he is at, or in a pan if they happen to have a pan, and they look at it, they're gone. 3 French Canadians, they go up and stake ground. 3 Nova Scotians, they go up and stake ground. And pretty soon the whole country knows about it. Henderson doesn't find out until days and days and days later. By then, Rabbit Creek, or Bonanza Creek, has been staked.
Yeah.
And so has El Dorado. And that is the beginning of the magnificent gold rush into the Yukon district, the Klondike area.
And that's 1896. That's when the shotgun shell filled with gold is displayed to the 3 French Canadians, and stuff begins to click.
And there's so much good ground on that creek that there's all sorts of debate and some real problems on the creek. So who do they call in? They call in Ogilvy, the Dominion Land Surveyor, and they say, Ogilvy, you've got to survey the whole creek. So he begins to survey the creek, and he starts surveying both Bonanza and El Dorado. And he does this meticulously. Here's the original civil servant, who's a marvelous, marvelous bureaucrat. And he does it. He doesn't even participate in it. He passed by millions and millions of dollars. Didn't mean anything to him at all. The only thing that meant anything to him was the job, and the job done right. So but he is a chain man, and he's going up, and what he finds is some of these claims are overstaked. So one of the claims just above the discovery
That means
claim,
two people have the same territory through some mistake.
No, it doesn't. It means that one man has taken too much.
More
ground than he is legally allowed.
Okay.
And so they come across a little fraction, a little tiny little fraction, and the fraction is 86 feet wide at its widest point and down to about a foot at its narrowest point. So it's pie-shaped. And one of his chain men, who's working with him, is a guy called Dick Lowe. He's an American. And Dick Lowe looks at this, and the rest of the creek is being staked. And he said, gee, it's pretty narrow. Can I stake it? And Ogilvy says, that's entirely up to you, because Dick Lowe is only working for Ogilvy. Ogilvy is a government employee. He will not stake. Yeah. And so Lowe says, oh, I'll go up the creek. And he looks up Bonanza Creek, and everything's all staked. He goes up El Dorado. It's all staked. Finally, reluctantly, he comes back to this little pie-shaped piece. He stakes it. He digs a hole down, goes down to bedrock, nothing. It's absolutely barren. Barren, nothing at all, not a color. So he tries then to sell his 86-foot pie-shaped fraction, and for $900. Nobody buys. They're not even interested. Then he tries to give it a layman's agreement. That is, get another guy in so he can get 10 or 15% on the ground.
He can have it for the work.
Sure. And he would only get 10% probably. Yeah. Nobody touches it. That's fine. He says, well, I'll try another spot. He moves over about 30 or 40 feet, sinks down to bedrock, and hits over 1 ton of gold.
A ton?
Yeah.
Are we talking 2,000 pounds of gold here?
Well, yeah, we're talking, actually gold sometimes measured in avoirdupois and sometimes in troy, but it's over a ton either way. And what happens, of course, Lowe immediately gets drunk to celebrate his good fortune. He stays drunk for the remainder of his time on the Yukon. He takes out well over a ton, but the guys who were working with him also took out a little more than a ton. That little fraction was probably the richest placer fraction in history. About 2.5 tons of gold came out of a little fraction like that.
Now, in what length of time did he extract this gold? We're talking the discovery. I'm thinking back to the shotgun shell.
1896, right.
So is that the summer of 96?
Yeah.
Lowe is right in there like a dirty shirt, getting his little fraction.
Sure.
How quickly does he come up with this gold?
Oh, he comes up, well, the thing is, in the first 8 hours, Mike, in the first 8 hours, he takes out $43,000 worth of gold. That's about 3,000 ounces. That's 250 pounds troy.
In the first 8 hours?
In the first 8 hours. Now, that's 8 times 480 minutes. He's taking out several ounces a minute, just digging in there. It's absolutely staggering. And that's not the only one that's staggering. I mean, there were other individuals who were equally fortunate. There was a guy called, eventually became known as the Lucky Swede, a guy called Charlie Anderson. He's sitting down there in 40 Mile. He missed the rush. He missed the rush. He is not there to stake on Bonanza or El Dorado. Yeah. And he's sitting there and he's drinking pretty heavily because he's annoyed that he's missed the rush. In the door comes 2 guys he knows, a guy called Winfield Oler, O-L-E-R. And Winfield Oler spots Anderson. Anderson is pretty well along in his cups. And Oler decides that he had staked a place called 29 El Dorado. And he has checked it. He's gone down, nothing there. So he's gonna palm this off on the unsuspecting Swede. So he sits down, Oler and his partner, and they have more drinks and more drinks. And before the night has elapsed, he has sold 29 El Dorado to the unsuspecting Swede, and he sold it for $800. Well, Oler is just ecstatic about it. He's got rid of a worthless claim for $800. The next morning, of course, Charlie Anderson wakes up. He's got a big hangover. He's not too happy. And he looks, all he's got, he has no money, but he has a bill of sale. Legally drawn up, Mike, and the bill of sale says he owns 29 El Dorado. Well, he knows that these guys aren't that green, so he goes running to Constantine, who was the Northwest Mounted Police commander in the area before Sam Steele, and he said, I bought a claim. He said, I was drunk. Constantine looks at the bill of sale, and he says, that's your signature. Very wobbly, shaky signature. And so Anderson looks at it and says, yeah, I guess it is. Well, he says, you bought a claim. You better go up there and take a look at it. So what he does, he goes up El Dorado, And he stops at 29. Sure enough, they'd been down. He looks at it. Then he looks at it a little closer. He jumps down on the claim, and it springs a little bit. It's a hard pan. It isn't a true bedrock. It's a false bedrock.
These guys thought they had dug down to bedrock.
Sure they did. Sure they did. They thought they dug down to bedrock. He jumps down. He goes through that hard pan just a few feet and takes out 2.5 tons of gold.
The lucky Swede.
The lucky Swede. But in the long run, it didn't. He lived high off the hog for several years. He bought a spanking new rig with matched black horses and everything else, and lived like a Klondike king for 2 years. Went to Europe and went all over the place. He finally dies pushing a wheelbarrow. I think it was on Texada Island in an advanced state of decay. Really, the guy never did make anything from it. Very few of these gold kings hung on to it. Now, some of them did, Mike, but a lot of them didn't. Then the lucky Swede took out 2.5 tons. He dies broke.
Now, again, in what context did he take out 2.5 tons? How long? Was this over a period of several years, or is this in the period of a very short time?
I think it was about 1.5 years. Now, I could be wrong. It could be 6 months out either way. But by the end of that time, by the time the gold was exhausted in his claim, he was broke as well. He just spent it as it came along. He thought it would never end. And this was typical of the time. But this isn't the whole story of 1896. The whole story is perhaps more interesting. And the whole story is this, is that there were some very shrewd individuals in here who didn't get on the creek diggings. That is, the diggings right along the creeks themselves. So they didn't get on the diggings on Hunker Creek or Gold Bottom or Quartz or Dominion or the two big ones, El Dorado and Bonanza. But there were some very sharp guys. One of them was called Caribou Billy Dietering, and he had a partner called Joe Staley. And Caribou Billy Dietering had been in the Caribou, and I mentioned this in the program years ago. He'd been in the Caribou many years before, and he was kind of an old prospector, a seasoned prospector, and a very, very analytical prospector. And he looks at this area, and he thinks that gold has to come from somewhere. So he notices some white gravel up above the creek. So he goes up there in a little place which eventually became known as French Hill, and he puts down a shaft within 20 feet of the trail, 20 to 25 feet of the trail. Miners walking all along it. He hits nothing. On the second shaft he puts down, he hits 1/4 pound of gold per pan. Well, what are they to do? He and Joe Staley then cover up this diggings, go down and stake and record their diggings, and French Hill comes into being. At the same time, there's another guy on another hill, just down the creek, actually, on Chichaco Hill, which means newcomer, beginner. Yeah. Chichaco means that if you're Chichaco...
Kind of a greenhorn.
Yeah, you're a real greenhorn in the Yukon. And his name is Oliver Millet. And Oliver Millet is another Canadian. He's from Nova Scotia. And he decides that he is going to check this ground, too. And he checks it. First hole's no good. Second hole's no good. Third one. Second hole, he hit 1 nugget. Third one, he hits it on the nose. Absolutely staggering. He stakes it, and what they had discovered, these two individuals, along with several others, about the same time, discovered the Great White Channel. And the White Channel was a kind of a bleached gravel. It looked like you would almost use bleach on the gravel. Very white. You can see it today when you go into the Dawson area, remnants of the White Channel that still exist, and it's really quite spectacular. And it was so rich. It was so rich that some of these guys, especially the guys who came out of the creek diggings, it averaged $1,000 a lineal foot. And that's recorded, so it probably averaged $2,000 a lineal foot. So, you know, this is really beyond comprehension in today's placer mining annals. I mean, there were guys who came, when they sent out the first shipment of gold in late 1896 aboard the Excelsior and the Portland, and they went down to Seattle. And the miners who got off, and there were only several dozen of them, got off, and some of them were absolutely loaded down with gold. Old man Stanley, who had been lamed in his earlier career, and he had been a bookseller in Seattle, and he staggered off the boat carrying $115,000 worth of gold. Now that doesn't sound like a lot from today's standards, but when you consider that was between 1/4 and 1/3 of a ton of gold.
No, he would stagger under this load.
Well, he had to make several trips. And Frank Piscator was the same thing, practically $100,000. A guy named Sloan from Nanaimo, one of the Sloans from Nanaimo, came down with 50-odd thousand. And when you multiply that, Mike, by 40 times, and it probably should be 40 times, you know, 40 times 50,000 is $2 million. 40 times 115,000 is 4 million. This was from a summer's work. And of course, by the time that hit the outside world, which was in a depression at that time, this was the 1896, 97, in a depression, severe depression, well, it made headlines all around the world. Klondike became world famous.
And what we've just discussed is the raw ground. There's no towns, there was no people yet.
Right.
This was a limited number of miners. When we come back, with what little time we have, we'll take a look at a couple of other stories, so don't go away. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts with Bill Barlee. We're talking about the Klondike Gold Rush, just 1 year, 1896, and in this little leather cup here is a treasure which, of course, came into your hands just recently.
That's right, Mike. I purchased it from a man who got it from the niece of a dance hall girl who had been in Dawson City in the 1890s. The dance hall girl, we think, danced in the Floridora Saloon, ended up her days dealing cards in that same place, and passed this on to her niece, who then left it to the man I purchased it from, and it weighs about 1/4 pound, and I paid him double the gold value in it.
There's a nugget every 1/4 inch here. I mean, a loving gift.
Sure.
Was this at all uncommon? Or is this a rare little trinket?
No, not really, because gold was very commonplace in the Yukon in the 1890s. I mean, it was not uncommon for the audience to watch a player on the stage, and they would throw nuggets on the stage or $20 gold pieces. Not uncommon at all. Some of the miners had outside their cabin doors, especially on Bonanza and Hunker and on El Dorado, they had a lard pail full of nuggets. They had a sign there, "Help yourself," and they meant it.
This is outrageous. I mean, the gold was it was as common as coal in Nanaimo, for heaven's sakes.
Sure. It was really quite astonishing era, Mike.
Now, also, I mean, what brought all the people? If you had 200 people or 400 people already on the site, everything staked, all the mines being used, why would anybody else come?
Well, because some of the miners made their initial stake, and they immediately sold out. And they didn't clean up all their ground. So that those several hundred claims in El Dorado and Bonanza were turned over, some of them a number of different times. And each one of those owners, in many cases, made a fortune by themselves.
Now, 96 would seem to me that everybody who was anybody was there and grabbed it. But how long did this bonanza last?
About 5 years, Mike. The top years were 5 years, right till about 1901. But even then, ever since that time, gold has continued to flow out of that area of the Yukon, precisely because the White Channel is a massive channel.
Yes, that's so remarkable. I'd love to see that White Channel as it applies right now. And to know that, how long is this, 6 feet?
6 feet, 2 inches long.
Well, excuse me, but I am going to just rope it around my neck just once. The whole place, it's been the Klondike Gold Rush, 1896, Tagish Charlie and Skukum Jim, and we'll be back next time with another story.